Oh geez, TMN, another female murderer? Well, yeah, sorry. But this is a wee bit different. Our subject today not only killed, she killed two women, not men. And that's not all she did. Grab whatever comfort items you need and get cozy. October 20th, 1931. We've got Dr. William C. Judd, the husband of the murderess, who is currently missing, trying to answer for these charges against her. What is she being accused of? Well, it's a lot and a bit grisly. Two women, Agnes Leroy, 35, and Hedwig Samuelson, 24, have been killed and put into trunks, allegedly by one Winnie Ruth Judd, who cannot be found at this time. So let's put this hearse in reverse. Dr. Judd had left Phoenix for Los Angeles trying to find a place for him to practice and was staying with his sister in Santa Monica. Winnie Ruth Judd, his wife, who seems to primarily go by Ruth, was a secretary to a doctor in Phoenix and was staying behind until her husband got things settled in LA. She was rooming with Hedwig, a school teacher, and also with Agnes, who was a trained nurse. They lived in part of a duplex together. But whoa Nelly, it could be said that they did not get along too well. One such argument was after some sort of drinking party with men that the other two ladies brought in, and then where Ruth wanted to kill a cat for some medical issue it had, and the other two protested. Ruth apparently had moved out and took a room elsewhere, but on a Friday night, the three women, plus another, a Mrs. Nace, had dinner together at the apartment. Late Saturday or early Sunday, Ruth had gone to the apartment, got into some sort of argument again, and shot Agnes through the temple, and Hedwig through the chest and abdomen. A third bullet hit Hedwig in the face. Then, apparently, Agnes was packed into a large trunk along with some mementos of hers. Hedwig's body was dismembered, and parts of her body were packed in a small trunk. Another part of her body was placed in a suitcase. Mr. Grimm, a drayman, said that Sunday afternoon a woman with the appearance of Ruth called him to the address and showed him the trunks, saying they contained books and to take them to Southern Pacific Station. Ruth bought a train ticket for LA. At the train's arrival in Los Angeles, the baggage man unloading them noticed blood oozing from both trunks. And when Ruth called for them, along with her younger brother who she had called for help, the baggage man refused to release the baggage. No, he didn't think there were humans inside. He thought they may have contained some kind of deer meat that had been killed out of season. He called for the railroad police, and when that happened, Ruth and the young man left everything and disappeared. The brother's name was B.J. McKennell, and he was a 23-year-old student at USC. His sister had asked for his assistance in getting the trunks and tossing them into the Pacific Ocean. When BJ was questioned by the police, he said this, quote, "I asked sis what was in the trunks, and she said bodies. She refused to give me details, saying I had better keep out of it. When the baggage man refused to give us the trunks, Ruth said, I am going to get out. I told her, that's a good idea. You'd best get out and get out quick." End quote. The police don't currently believe that he doesn't know where his sister is, but he says he doesn't. Dr. Judd's sister, or Ruth's sister-in-law, says, quote, "I can't bring myself to believe a thing of this kind has occurred. I'm quite sure Dr. Judd's wife could not have done anything like that. The relations between Dr. Judd and his wife were of the best and always harmonious. He received many letters from her in which she wrote of personal matters between them, and there was nothing in the letters to indicate that anything was wrong. Why, he got a letter from her only yesterday in which she wrote of family matters and the financial difficulties everybody seems to be having." End quote. Here's what the police put out on the radio. Quote, "Arrest on suspicion of murder, Winnie Ruth Judd, American, 27, 5 feet 6 inches tall, about 125 pounds, dark complexion, bluish-gray eyes, light brown hair. She wore a black hat and a black and white dress. She is suspected of murdering and bringing to Los Angeles in 2 trunks the bodies of Agnes and Leroy and Hedwig Samuelson, Hold the Ford Roadster, license IX4267, driven by Mrs. Judd and all occupants of the car, and search carefully for fingerprints if car is found abandoned." End quote. Dr. Judd was grilled several times, as I mentioned, and he said this, quote, "Ruth must have had an accomplice if she committed those murders. I can't imagine how she, weighing only 100 pounds and ill, she suffers from tuberculosis, could have crammed those bodies into the trunks. When I left Phoenix, Ruth remained in our old apartment until recently, when, after quarrels with the other women, she moved to an apartment on Brill Street." End quote. He continues, quote, "Ruth had a position as secretary at the Lois Greenough Memorial Clinic, where Mrs. Leroy was x-ray technician. Mrs. Samuelson was a patient there, so through their work and living in the same duplex house, the three women were thrown into close association constantly. I had several letters from my wife that indicated she was quarreling frequently with the other two women before she finally moved away from the duplex bungalow." End quote. Back at the apartment, George Brisbois, chief of police, quote, "Bloodstains found on rugs and furniture indicated that two women had been killed there, and their bodies placed in trunks and taken to 1120 East Brill Street, where Mrs. Winnie Ruth Judd, who formerly roomed with Miss Leroy and Miss Samuelson, resided." End quote. BJ, her brother, would state at the time she left the car. Quote, "She got out of the car at 7th and Main Streets or 7th and Broadway. I was so dazed and shocked by it all that I'm not sure, and I haven't seen her since. I drove back to the university and had lunch at a lunchroom nearby, and then went to class to study for an hour. Then I went to Roosevelt High School and worked on the grounds until 4 p.m., after which I returned to the university for 2 hours more of study in the library. After another lunch, I studied for another half hour and then started for Santa Monica to see my sister's husband, Dr. Judd. At the first intersection, I bought a newspaper and read about the trunk murders. After that, I drove fast to Dr. Judd's house and told him about Ruth and the trunks." End quote. Dr. Judd is stating that Ruth takes a sedative to help her sleep and that she owned a .25 caliber revolver, which were like the wounds in the bodies. So first, the police were thinking the motive was some sort of love triangle among the three women. A day later, the motive has changed to one that the prosecution will probably be using. Apparently, there was a love feud between Ruth and Agnes. Not between the two of them, but over a man that both of them liked. A J.J. or Jack Halloran, rich lumberman. So possibly that's why Ruth killed Agnes, because Ruth wanted Jack. So why kill Hedwig? Of course, all conjecture, but perhaps Hedwig tried to interfere, or Ruth was like, might as well get rid of you too. Considering 2 of the 3 parties are deceased and party number 3 is still missing, we're just assuming not the took is here. But let's conjecture some more. Apparently Ruth was going steady with Jack, and Agnes wasn't having it. She returned and once again became the favorite. Now, yes, Ruth was married at this point, but not on good terms with Dr. Judd, allegedly, although letters from her to him would say differently. But Agnes winning this love battle was allegedly a motive. October 24th. Ruth is now in jail after surrendering and confession the night before. What is she saying happened? Here are some snippets from her exclusive story in the newspaper. Quote, "I shot to save my life. Miss Samuelson plainly meant to kill me when she first fired at me. Miss Leroy was doing her best to kill me with an ironing board. I was terrified. I knew that it would not be long before the bodies were found. I had no friends, and I did not know where my husband was. I didn't want to get my brother into any more trouble, so I started out alone. I walked and walked and walked until it was dark. Then I found an unoccupied house. I went into it, and that was my hiding place. My hand was hurting me terribly. The bullet was still in it, and the only bandage I had was my handkerchief." End quote. She would stay put for a couple of days, then she ventured out to get some dye to dye her dress. Quote, "All this time my only thought was to get in touch with my husband. I knew he would help me if I could talk to him. The thought of suicide was never in my head. I thought I had done nothing to die for, that I had been perfectly justified in what I had done. But I wanted my husband's help and advice before I surrendered." End quote. She wanted to get in touch with him by telephone, but she didn't have his number, and she tried to get information, but she was told unless she gave them her name and location, they wouldn't give the number to her. Well, of course, that would not be a good idea. She was going to try to get a letter to him when she purchased a newspaper and saw his appeal for her to surrender, that he had procured lawyers for her. Then she had her answer. The morning before her surrender, she called one of his lawyers and made arrangements to speak. She would surrender and was put in the LA County Jail Hospital charged with murder. Dr. Judd took care of her hand wound temporarily until she had surgery as it had gotten infected. This is part of her confession to one of the attorneys regarding the incident itself. Quote, "Suddenly, Miss Samuelson became infuriated at me. It seemed that she thought I was going to say something about Mrs. Leroy. Everything happened so fast after that I have difficulty in remembering details of what occurred. In her rage, Miss Samuelson left the room and came back immediately. I saw that she had a gun in her hand. She was rushing towards me. I was petrified with fear. Before I could do anything or even scream, she fired. The bullet hit me in the hand and stung dreadfully. The blood came. I lunged towards her and grabbed her. We wrestled around and both of us fell to the floor. The gun fell from her hand and it was there between us. We fought desperately. Finally, I managed to get my hand on the gun and shot her. I couldn't see what Mrs. Leroy was doing while this was going on. It all happened so quick. The first thing I knew after I shot was that Mrs. Leroy was pounding me over the head with an ironing board. I tried to dodge her blows, but couldn't. I was getting weaker and weaker. Then I shot her too." End quote. October 26, 1931. We're still in Los Angeles, but she's facing extradition to Phoenix, which she doesn't want. State of Arizona is already saying they will attempt to have her hanged. They recovered some evidence that, though this was appearing to be a spontaneous attack, they found a flushed, torn-up letter in a restroom. And when pieced together, intimated that Ruth had thought about killing her former roommates days before the incident. Already an insanity plea is being discussed. One of the attorneys is intending to call on alienists to head to the jail to examine Ruth. It is thought that at the very least, Ruth would be charged with premeditated murder of Agnes, who was unarmed. Wait, what? Well, the toilet letter stated that Ruth killed Agnes, quote, "because she was going to blackmail me and hand me over to the police after I killed Miss Samuelson," end quote. October 27th, 1931. We're waiting for extradition to Phoenix. In the meantime, police are still gathering evidence, mainly in their attempt to show that this was not self-defense, as Ruth declares. In the desert, a blood-soaked mattress and parts of 2 sheets were found, stained with blood. And did someone help her drive out to this location? The men who moved the trunks to the station, one of them would state, his name is Fred Stone, quote, "I have positive feeling that someone was in the house besides Mrs. Judd. I based that conclusion on Mrs. Judd's actions in the house and the fact that she kept it entirely dark all the time we were there," end quote. October 30th. Ruth was escorted to Phoenix today. Chief Deputy County Attorney G.A. Rogers, quote, "If insanity is pleaded, it will be the duty of the court to impanel a regular jury to decide on Mrs. Judd's sanity. If that jury finds her insane, the court must commit her to the Arizona Hospital for the Insane. However, at any time subsequent to her being committed, the law can reach her. The state can cite Mrs. Judd before a sanity commission, and if the commission finds she is restored to sanity, then she must be transferred to the county jail and a murder trial must be held. We are ready to combat an attempt to save Mrs. Judd from the gallows by an insanity plea. And I expect to be able to convince a jury, if necessary, that she is mentally sound," end quote. November 6th. Police can't get any change to Ruth's story of self-defense, even though they don't believe a word of it. Still talk of an insanity defense. Ruth's tuberculosis, which has been what they would say was inactive, is back active, so her health is not too great at the moment. So we've gone through the preliminary hearing. She's being held for the grand jury. January 19th, 1932. Trial is starting. Everyone wants a seat. Only men will be on the jury, as women are not yet allowed on juries in Arizona. Well, we're still trying to get jurors, so the meat and potatoes of the trial hasn't begun. Her brother is not allowed to attend the trial as he is an intended witness. Same with her parents. January 22nd. The trunks that held the bodies of her former friends were brought into the courtroom. We've got witnesses, but one of the ones we'll detail is Detective Ryan, who is the one that had to pop open the trunks. Quote, "When I looked into the trunk, I pulled back a quilt and uncovered the head of a woman. Her hair was dark. The body was packed in letters, photographs, and newspapers. We found 2 purses in the trunk. One of the purses contained a medical thermometer, 2 empty .25 caliber pistol shells, and a lead bullet. An empty shell of the same caliber was in the other purse. The smaller of the 2 trunks contained portions of the body of Miss Samuelson. The lower part of her body was missing. This was found in a brown suitcase which had been left by Mrs. Judd in the women's restroom of the Southern Pacific Station." End quote. Miss Lucille Moore, nurse, was a witness, testifying about a conversation she had with Ruth the day before the murders. Ruth had confessed to Lucille about the issues with her former roommates. According to Lucille, Ruth told her, quote, "You know our differences were over Jack," end quote. Lucille would continue, quote, "The day I met Mr. Halloran, he came to Mrs. Judd's house and got her and me. We drove to Miss Samuelson's cottage. Halloran was to get a couple of his men friends there and take them to a dinner party we were to have at Mrs. Judd's. On the way, Mrs. Judd asked Halloran if he remembered his promise not to tell Miss Samuelson and Agnes Leroy that she, Mrs. Judd, was out in the car. Halloran dashed into the house, and Mrs. Judd and I sat in his car and talked. She asked me if I knew who lived there. I said I did not, and she said, 'I will tell you.' About that time, Mrs. Leroy came and looked out of the window, and Mrs. Judd said, 'Well, now you know who lives here.' A little later, Mrs. Judd asked me, 'What do you think of Jack?' I said I liked him fine. She said, 'He's even better than fine. He's perfectly grand.' While we were talking about Mr. Halloran, Mrs. Judd told me she and Mrs. Leroy had quarreled over him. Halloran stayed in the bungalow only a minute or 2 and then came out with his friends. They were introduced to me as Mr. Ryan and Mr. Townsend. Then Anne, Mrs. Leroy, came to the door and said, 'Hello.' Halloran got in the car with 2 men, and we drove to Mrs. Judd's and had dinner. After dinner, I asked them to take me home." End quote. Dr. Joseph Catton, Stanford psychiatrist, believed Ruth to be sane, and she knew the difference between right and wrong. He believed that in conversations with her, she was inferring that she had an accomplice. She also admitted her romance with Jack Halloran. Quote, "She told me she believed a woman could love 2 men. She told me that no one but Jack Halloran took a drink at the girl's apartment the night of the crime. She told me that without Jack Halloran, there would have been no Ruth Judd case." End quote. She refused to elaborate any further. February 8th. Arizona jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, which carries a mandatory death sentence of a hanging. Her attorneys do plan to appeal. February 24th. Due to be sentenced to hang, she declared she has an accomplice. She wrote a letter to her husband. Quote, "The trial wasn't honest or fair. I don't want to die. I insist that, bleep, be arrested before Judge Speakman sentences me. Bleep came in then. I was wild. He was drunk. He shook me, pulled me to his car to go see. We entered the kitchen. He looked at the site. He picked Sammy up, carried her to Anne's bed, asked me to clean things up a little. He said he would get someone to take the bodies out to the desert in a truck. He said Sammy's body had been cut in 2 and both were in the trunk." End quote. Sammy is Mrs. Samuelson, or Hedwig. Anne is Agnes Leroy. Anne is her middle name. The rest of 1932 is spent with her lawyers doing appeals, trying to get a new trial or trying to state that she's insane, that the judge of the trial did not properly give self-defense instructions to the jury. The state doesn't think she should have any changes to anything that's happened, that the trial was fair. It's mid-December, Supreme Court of Arizona telling Ruth she can't have a new trial. The warden was the one that broke the news to her. Her lawyers have re-appealed. And we're back at grand jury, who have decided that Ruth did indeed act on self-defense, and they sent their recommendation to the pardon board. And when did they do that? After Jack Halloran had been indicted. Not with murder, but as an accessory to murder. He's denied the charges, calling them a false and grave injustice. He appeared in court voluntarily and posted $3,000 bond. His attorney intends to file a motion that the grounds are defective. One of Ruth's counsel, Arthur Verge, said, quote, "That changes the whole complexion of things. Now that the whole story is out, we shall proceed vigorously with every possible attack upon Mrs. Judd's death sentence. We shall take an appeal to the United States Supreme Court and also will place the case before the Arizona State Board of Pardons and Paroles with a petition for a commutation of sentence. Papers now are being drawn for the appeal, and the pardon board will get the case at the earliest possible moment. certainly within 2 weeks. A new board takes office Monday, and we intend to wait only until they have had time to organize. Mrs. Judd has told me at least 20 times the story she told a grand jury." End quote. So, again, how does Halloran figure into this? Well, Ruth killed the 2 women in self-defense. A doctor, who is now apparently dead, was called by Halloran to dispose of the bodies. Ruth's quite happy at this turn of events. Now, Jack does have a wife and 3 children, and he stated, quote, "We'll take our medicine and there's no yellow streak up our spine. I'm glad it is all coming out. It will clear the air and people will not have so much to talk about." End quote. January 1933. We're only at the preliminary hearing phase for Halloran's charge, so why haven't I mentioned it much? Well, because he's been released on all charges. Why? Well, if Ruth committed the crime in self-defense, it ain't a crime. So you can't hold Halloran as an accessory to nothing. Judge Miles said, quote, "I try to reconcile the evidence presented. The theory of self-defense was borne out by the witness, Mrs. Judd. Corroboration was most unsatisfactory. In view of the circumstances, if I should bind the defendant Halloran over to Superior Court, it would be an abuse. Trial in Superior Court would be an idle gesture and an expense to the taxpayers of this county." End quote. Ruth was actually happy with the outcome, if only because she thought if they did this with him, they would be more lenient with her. January 28, 1933. Well, we do have a stay of execution until April 14th instead of the original February 17th. March 14th, 1933. We're in front of the pardon board. She is asking for a full pardon, but if that's not granted, she wants her death penalty commuted to just life in prison instead. Well, no. They denied her plea for mercy. And also it came out interestingly that 3 weeks prior to the pardon board decision, she had tried to escape. It's believed her brother, B.J. McKinnell, tried to help her and that she had managed to almost saw 2 bars in 2 before workers saw what she had done, with 2 small saws found in her cell. Her mother's plea is what kept Ruth out of the dungeon. Bookmark this for later. You'll need it. Oh, let's say about 7 times. And let's say the word together, kids. Appeal. April 12th, 1933. Her hanging day is coming soon, and the hanging coming up on her doorstep has caused her to attempt her own life. Stopped by a prison matron and a guard when she tried to swallow a double-edged razor blade. She was so hysterical that they had to put her in a special cell. I don't believe it was a padded cell, but one devoid of basically anything. April 13th, 1933. She will have a sanity hearing. If the Superior Court jury decides by 3/4 vote that she is insane, she will be committed to the State Hospital for the Insane in Phoenix. This decision, if they decide she's insane, is the only thing that will save her from the noose. Time is ticking, though. Apparently, if they reach the intended hanging day and this hearing is still happening, she will hang regardless, unless her attorneys can get an extension. So I'm not going to get into her insanity hearing too much because the story is extremely long, but suffice it to say her husband, Dr. Judd, at one point on the stand said, quote, "If Ruth isn't insane, they had better empty the asylums for her condition is as abnormal as that of any patient," end quote. Dr. George Stevens, defense alienist, said, quote, "She is suffering from delusions and hallucinations, from the persecution mania, and many other abnormalities that are found only in advanced cases of insanity," end quote. Dr. Pinkerton said if Ruth had, quote, "all of the knowledge of the 6 experts attending this trial and the acting ability of Sarah Bernhardt, she could not fake the complete picture of sanity she presents," end quote. 4 of the state's alienists have said she is not only sane, but is shamming the symptoms on which defense witnesses have said she must be insane for exhibiting. April 23rd, 1933, after her temporary stay of execution, she's been found insane after 5 ballots and 2 hours of deliberation. It only needed to be the 9 of the 12 jurors that voted insanity. And now she's been put in the Arizona State Hospital for the insane. 1934, basically pardon requests, which were all denied. 1935. I'm not going to get into these too much because they come off and on, but the family continues to appeal. stating she will never again regain her sanity as long as she knows that the death penalty is hanging over her head, because if she's sane, she will be hanged. Just know that during these years, appeals for a pardon or for parole come and go and are all denied for the time being. August 1937, Ruth's parents appealed to the governor to pardon their daughter. Yet, October 25th, 1939. Escape number 1. Ruth said adios to the state hospital. I mean, she wasn't supposed to, but she decided it was time for her to go. She packed clothing and rags into her bed to make it look like she was still in bed, and she skedaddled. Apparently post-escape, she stopped by her parents' house for a visit at about midnight. Her parents urged her to stay so they could let the authorities know, but she didn't want that and left, leaving them a letter to send to the governor before she headed out. In typical parent fashion, because it's parents, they did not call the police at any point. It wouldn't be until 9:30 a.m. that her absence was noticed and wasn't reported to the governor until noon. Every inspection during the night yielded that they thought she was asleep in bed. Dr. Joseph Catton, psychiatrist, and who had checked her during her court appearances, believed she had recovered her sanity. Quote, she will probably go into hiding or will attempt to flee to Mexico, which she visited many times before the double murder. If her husband is still alive, she may try to reach him. I do not look for her to commit any violent act. I believe she is in command of her senses. She broke under the strain of anticipating her execution. I think she recovered some time ago from that ordeal. End quote. October 26, 1939. The hunt is continuing. They anticipate she may go to see her husband, Dr. William Judd. He has been in treatment at Sawtelle's Veteran Hospital, but when he heard that she escaped, he left that facility. Reappearing at the post office to see if there was any mail. He has not returned to his house. He did, prior to leaving the vet hospital, ask for his wife to give herself up. The 3 theories about where she is are: 1, heading for Mexico. Apparently she speaks Spanish fluently. 2, trying to get to LA to see her husband. And 3, hiding somewhere in or near Phoenix. Where Dr. Catton was like, yeah, she's sane. Police are like, no, not even. Her behavior at the hospital recently had been odd. The note she left with her parents for the governor wasn't completely coherent. The hospital had allowed her to provide for the care of 2 babies that had had some sort of issues. Whether developmental or not, I'm not really sure. The first was a 5-year-old girl who, by all accounts, was well taken care of by Ruth. The child would die, though, 6 months later. Again, this child was called subnormal in the newspapers. I don't know what the child was suffering with. Ruth nearly took her own life with grief, suffering from depression and despair. Oddly enough, the doctors would then allow her to care for another child, but when hospital management changed, the child was taken from her. She did not do well with the loss of having someone to care for her, I'm guessing. At the change of that management, she was no longer allowed to visit with family without a guard standing there. She couldn't earn any kind of money doing hairdressing for anyone. All of these things piling up in her psyche just made her want to get out. This is all conjecture, of course, but I could see that. October 27th, 1939. Ruth's father is very unwell, and doctors are saying that if he dies, Ruth can blame herself for that with her escape. Her mother pleaded with her to surrender. October 30th, 1939, Governor Jones is sick of this crap and is taking charge of the search, sending out 2 appeals to her to surrender and promising no extra punishment if she does. Well, it's October 31st. Happy Halloween! Ruth has surrendered to authorities after nearly a week of being out and about and doing stuff. The night before she surrendered, she went to the home of a minister well known to her, but who wants to remain anonymous, holding a butcher knife and asking him to take her out of Phoenix. He tried to offer her food or to have a talk, and she was like, nope, I want out of here. As he began driving, he thought to trick her by driving towards the asylum, but she caught on, jumped out of his moving car, and ran into the dark. She surrendered by banging on the hospital door, carrying a tote bag of food scraps, and getting really ticked when they tried to ask her questions. Apparently, her account of her almost week spent out was chaotic. In part being in a cornfield and then being in an orange grove, one night in a vacant apartment. So how did she get out? According to Dr. Sachs, head of the hospital at this point. Quote, "A key to her ward, which we had listed as lost months ago, was found on her person when she returned." End quote. She had stolen the key and kept it hidden until she felt she could escape. Early December 1939. Escape number 2. For the second time in 5 weeks, she has left the state hospital. Her mom is very concerned. Quote, "I'm afraid she will never be back to the hospital alive." End quote. A note she had left for Reverend Warrant, a family friend that she visited after her escape, stated that she couldn't stand it any longer and she had to get away, that she was in fear for her life. He had not been at home at the time. The note she left also said she would return the 2 coats she had taken, and her mother would pay for the 4 oranges and crackers. The second note she had left at the Reverend's house was for the governor, contents unknown. Now, remember that minister she had threatened with a knife? Hearing she was out for a second time, he came to the police and demanded protection, stating, "Winnie Ruth wants revenge. She thinks I betrayed her." Now, it's been a few days, no word, but police and the asylum workers believe she is in poor health. Again, she has what is called an arrested case of tuberculosis. After her first escape, she suffered a collapse. Mentally or physically or both, I'm not sure. If she was sleeping out in the open or in dilapidated sheds, eating little, she wouldn't last very long. They also still believe she could take her own life, thinking that with her she has a straight-edge razor with her, as one was missing from the barber shop at the hospital where she worked. December 7th. Dr. Judd is in Phoenix with Ruth's parents, and the house is of course being watched closely to see if Ruth returns if she finds out that he's in the city. Dr. Judd would say, quote, "I feel quite certain that Winnie Ruth received no help. I don't know of anyone who would help her, and I don't know what she hopes to gain by running away and hiding." End quote. December 12th. Governor Jones says that the personnel at the hospital will be in the midst of some shakeups after this escape. You think she's the only one escaping this place? One Brino Hanks, considered one of the most dangerous patients at this hospital, made his 4th escape last week. He was captured, but Ruth is still out and about. December 16th. Well, she's back. After 13 days on the lam, she's returned. She apparently walked on foot for 200 miles across the Arizona desert, eating stolen crackers and fruit, and ended up in Yuma. Why did she escape? Quote, "They said they were going to cut off my head. I wasn't trying to escape. I had to get away from that hospital. I had to get protection." End quote. She was holding an 11-page letter addressed to the Arizona legislature with what she believed to be new evidence. April 8, 1941. In her room at the state hospital, Ruth allegedly cut the heavy screen on the window, but she confessed to it without actually trying to escape. Dr. Jeremiah P. Metzger, superintendent of the hospital at this time, has had her transferred to another building, and she seems to be happier with that arrangement. July 1941. Arizona Board of Paroles and Pardons are considering a petition to commute her death sentence. This petition states that Ruth is not being treated properly by the state hospital because if she were restored to good mental health, she would be put to death. The death penalty is, according to this petition committee, quote, "an obstacle in the administration of psychiatry, preventing the hospital staff from doing anything more to improve Mrs. Judd's mental condition." End quote. I have to admit, that's interesting and makes sense. If the state hospital tried to help her mental health, and she indeed improved and became sane, the hospital is, in a way, complicit in having her put to death, just in trying to do what their main objective is, or at least should be. Whoa. Let that sink in. We're a year later. It's July 1942. Ruth's father, Reverend Harvey McKinnell, has passed away. Ruth was allowed to leave the hospital with escort to view his body. However, she did not want to attend the services in public. He was 82 years old. Mrs. McKinnell, who had herself voluntarily committed several months earlier to be with her daughter, did attend the services. He has spent much of his time, while his health permitted it, to try to free his daughter. October 24th, 1945. Dr. William Judd, husband of Ruth, has passed away at the National Military Home in Los Angeles. He was a veteran of, I'm assuming, World War I, and had been in the home for only a handful of days before passing away. He was 62. May 12th, 1947. Once, twice, 3 times an escape. But Ruth has escaped from the state hospital and within 12 hours was recaptured near the luxurious Arizona Biltmore Hotel. She had escaped from a second-floor cell room, last seen at 9 p.m., not discovered missing until midnight. Dr. John Larson, hospital superintendent, said he believed she had a key to open the second-floor door so she could go down a stairwell, and a second key for the ground level. A gate on the north side of the grounds was found open. Bloodhounds were unable to pick up her trail. Bus stations, airport, and rail station were all being searched. Dr. Larson had relayed that 10 days ago he had moved her from the infirmary to new quarters, and she wasn't happy about it, apparently because being in the infirmary gave her too many liberties, according to Dr. Larson. And now she finds herself in a double-locked room with 2 keys, each held by a different worker. Ruth is saying she escaped because Dr. Larson would not allow her to see her mother on Mother's Day. Dr. Larson says that statement is without foundation. Unfortunately, this is why Dr. Larson had moved Ruth out of the infirmary. Quote, "The real reason I ordered the transfer was because I had found she had recently beaten her mother and given her a black eye. This is verifiable by the records. I was afraid the old lady," which is Mrs. Carrie B. McKinnell, Mrs. Judd's mother, 80, who had several heart attacks, would die if it happened again. The last beating she gave her mother was not the first. I couldn't take the responsibility for leaving her, Ruth, near her mother. Her claims that I refused her permission to visit her mother on Mother's Day are without foundation. She insisted she wanted to see the old lady alone, and I couldn't take the chance on letting her. I offered to go with her myself in company with the supervisor, but she refused, demanding that she be permitted to go alone." End quote. November 30th, 1951. No one puts Ruth in a corner, or rather, no one can keep Ruth in a corner. Escape number 4. She's still in the state hospital for the insane who cannot keep Ruth down, or in. It's been 20 years since the murders. She's 46 or so now, and she climbed out of a second-story window at 10:30 p.m. on a ladder she made of rags and cloth scraps. Earlier that evening, she'd been hanging out with her mother, Mrs. McKinnell, who is now 84, and also attended a dance for the patients. Hospital workers said that it must have taken her quite some time to weave this ladder. She had used a screwdriver and pliers to pry open the heavy window screen. How'd she get those? She secured the ladder to the headboard of her mother's bed, which was in a room adjoining her own. It's conjectured that another patient had told her that she'd be taken away from her mother and put into the criminal ward. Apparently, though, workers would find out about this and tell her there was no truth to the story. But Ruth was so distraught that she would tell one worker that she would take her own life if they tried to take her away from her mom. It appears that she had gone over the west gate. Some of her things were seen within about 200 yards. Bloodhounds were put on her assumed trail. She was last seen in a blue silk dress and a green coat with fur cuffs. The so-called tiger woman of her younger days. She spent the time fairly quietly, working on the hair of her fellow inmates and patients and taking care of her elderly mother. Less than 24 hours later, she was recaptured. The police located her in an apartment of a former hospital worker who had left the apartment and Ruth had gone in, having a meal, writing letters, and putting on some of the women's clothes. She spent the morning there, walking around downtown, sending off her letters, and wandering around until it got dark. She was reported to have said on her recapture, quote, "Why did you have to pick me up? I've served 20 years out there, and I think I should be turned loose. I had a tragedy 20 years ago that I wasn't wholly responsible for," end quote. Now, post-escape, she's had her privileges revoked. Her room was removed of all but the barest necessities, including the beauty shop equipment she had in order to do the other patient's hair. Her visiting privileges with her mother could be revoked. February 2nd, 1952. Well, she's gone again. Escape number 5. She's now about 47 and was last seen wearing a navy blue dress. All exits out of the state, and particularly those entrances into Mexico, are being watched as Ruth had the police flummoxed. Sheriff L.C. Boyce said, quote, "We have no clues, and none of the usual tips received have panned out," end quote. She opened a third-story tower window, slid down a 48-foot rope made from, of all things, restraining straps. I do appreciate the irony. And she disappeared. Dr. Conway, hospital director, states, quote, "There is no doubt she had outside help. About a week ago, we received a tip that Mrs. Judd was going to get outside help to make another escape. We put a special guard outside the ward. He stayed there 3 nights before we decided it was just another rumor and took the guard off." End quote. Well, whoops. It's February 8th now, a handful of days later. And lo and behold, look who is back on her own recognizance. She was brought to the home of the hospital and superintendent, a bit scratched up and bruised at midnight, only stating, "I'm back." She was driven in the house and dropped off by who? No one saw, and she wouldn't say. But Dr. Conway believes, quote, "But I surmised from what she said that they were not only young, but there was more than one of them." End quote. Ugh, those kids. So apparently she had picked a lock to the 3rd-story tower while everyone else was watching TV. Climbed the stairs, went down the rope of straps. The rope broke while she was still a good 12 to 15 feet from the ground, hence why she got a bit bruised up. Also, she went over a 9-foot barbed wire fence, walked through some of the yards of the houses of the on-location staff members, went through the hospital graveyard, crossed a canal, and headed north. Good night, nurse. She didn't have an easy time during this escape. She never left Phoenix. I'm guessing didn't really have a plan of sorts, had little in the way of food. Now they're saying she had facelifting. I don't think they mean the actual surgery, but she had had her eyebrows plucked and her already red-dyed hair was newly tinted, so she couldn't eat, but she did have a bit of a makeover. So why did she come back? Allegedly, it was because she wanted to be allowed to talk to the county grand jury. So they're looking a little more into Ruth's escape and return. 2 men who had made an appeal on behalf of Ruth regarding her welfare before she would return were said to be a Phoenix private detective and a Phoenix clergyman. Dr. Conway said basically over his dead body that she would get a grand jury hearing. I'm being dramatic, but yes, he would block any attempt. However, a Maricopa County attorney said that she would be subpoenaed to appear. We're now about 3 months later, May 1952. Governor Howard Pyle is mulling over possibly commuting her death sentence and turning it into life in prison. Arizona Board of Pardons and Paroles recommended it. Dr. Conway at the hospital recommended it. The jury recommended it. So, Governor, it's up to you. Well, he would decide within a few days to commute the death sentence. It's now life in prison. So regardless if she's deemed sane or still insane, it will be life in prison. No chance of the death penalty coming into play. His main reasons were the multitude of recommendations given to him that commuting would be the right thing to do. If she is deemed sane, she would be sent to the Arizona State Prison. Her time in the mental institution would be considered time served. However, the governor did express regret that any future governor could give her parole and free her. So, well, welcome to November 28th, 1952. A friend of mine used to say the phrase, 6 of one, half dozen of another, and that leads us to escape number 6. Yes, Ruth got herself out of a sawed window screen the night before. Once again, hospital superintendent Dr. Conway, who has to be just like WTF, said, quote, she had helped some way or another to make the escape, end quote. Lieutenant Frank Mitchell agreed. They scoured the grounds to no avail. According to Dr. Conway, the night before, she complained of a headache and decided to take a bath, headed that direction with a robe over her arm. 15 minutes passed by. A worker looked in the room, and she had disappeared down the drain. No. A whole 15-inch square was found out of the window screen. The glass window had been cranked open. At least this time, she was only 6 feet off the ground. Why does this keep happening? She was even put in the hospital's strongest ward, but nothing can keep this woman inside. Once again, Dr. Conway had some suspicions that she was ill at ease. She had stopped writing letters, had become quiet. He thinks she had been sawing at the screen for months, hiding the sawed wires with chewing gum. The window cranks on the only 2 windows in this ward are locked. So even though the governor commuted her sentence and people thought, well, hey, maybe this will stop her trying to leave, no. But wait, 46 hours of fresh air and it's Thanksgiving Day evening, and she's been caught. She was found hiding in the closet of her guardian, Mrs. Harvey. Mrs. Harvey is guardian with regards to Ruth's estate after Ruth's husband had passed away. The only living relative Ruth has is her mother, who is with her at the state hospital. She was hiding under a pile of clothes and when found, called out, quote, "Why don't you leave me alone? Please let me stay for a while. I want to get a job and see some people. I'm tired of being locked out," end quote. She didn't resist them, and when she was placed in the police car, she said, quote, "I've been locked up long enough. I should be turned loose and allowed to lead a normal life again," end quote. Apparently, other patients have helped her escape. Dr. Conway called her a troublemaker, which riled her up a bit. Quote, "I don't quarrel with patients. They've helped me escape. Nurses have hidden me on the grounds until I could get away. Attendants have hidden me in their homes. 5 of them helped hide me in their homes last time I escaped. Would they do this if I were dangerous? Would they have kept me in their homes? Would some of the best people of Phoenix have entertained me?" End quote. Ruth is not happy with Dr. Conway, who has restricted her activities since he became superintendent. She also accuses him of lying. He had said just a few days before her escape he had inspected the very window she had escaped out of and said nothing was amiss. She snorted and said that he, quote, "lied if he said he examined that window a day before I got out. The screen bulged so bad anyone could have seen it. The chewing gum kept popping out," end quote. It's a year later, November 1953. Sadly, Mrs. Carrie McKennell, Ruth's mother, who is now 87, died in the state hospital. She had entered the hospital 10 years earlier voluntarily to be with her daughter Ruth. Dr. Conway, perhaps sensing that Ruth was very low with the death of her mother, allowed her to attend the state fair. Under heavy guard, of course, but from what I can tell, she gave them no trouble. And then it's been nearly 9 years of no news. October 10th, 1962. Ruth once again has had it with the state mental hospital and she escaped. She's now like 57 and apparently slipped out of an unlocked door and through a section of fence that had been knocked over by some nearby freeway builders. If you've lost count, this is her 7th in 23 years. Hospital superintendent, though, considers Ruth to not be a danger to the public anymore. Now, here's where my ability to get free newspaper information ends, so I had to turn to the internet. She actually was out and about away from the hospital for over 6 years, finding work with a family in California under a different name. Eventually, she would be found out and taken back to Arizona in 1969. Ruth would eventually be paroled in 1971 after going through the courts to get her release. In 1983, Arizona would say, "Begone with you," in considering her completely discharged and no longer under parole. She actually went back to California and continued to work for that family that she had in the 1960s. Then she returned to Arizona, where she would pass away at the age of 93. Yes, 93 in the year 1988. You gotta admit, the lady had moxie. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to have next week, but we'll find out together. See you.